Breeding farms for enslaved people were a horrific reality in America. The year is 1825. A low fire crackles in a Virginia plantation office, the only sound besides the quiet breathing of the young woman standing in the center of the room. Two men watch her, one her owner, the other a trader from the deep south. His voice is a dry rustle of paper. "Good stock," he says. "Sturdy hips, prime age for a breeder." A quill pen scratches against the stiff page of a ledger. He notes her teeth, her height, her perceived fertility. Her future is not being decided by her skills or her spirit. It is being calculated by the number of children her body can be forced to produce for the cotton fields hundreds of miles away. This moment was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was the end point of a cold, deliberate national strategy. How do you get to that room? How does a nation born from a cry for liberty create a system to farm human beings for profit? And why did the moral victory of banning the African slave trade create an even more monstrous domestic nightmare? To find the answer, we must go back 3 decades to a simple invention that lit the fuse on an economic explosion. A machine that would demand a terrible human price. The sound that changed America began as a simple mechanical rhythm. A soft, steady scraping, a wooden crank turns, and with it a drum studded with small, sharp hooks. A rhythmic time scrape, thump, asterisk. This was the sound of progress in 1793, the sound of a problem being solved. The man turning that crank was Eli Whitney, a recent Yale graduate, a northerner visiting a Georgia plantation. He was an outsider, a tutor, an inventor with a mind that saw systems and solutions where others saw only backbreaking work. And in the American South, he saw the biggest problem of all, cotton. The fluffy white bolls were everywhere, but they were almost useless. The valuable fibers were tangled in a mass of sticky, stubborn green seeds. To clean it was a brutal, painstaking process. An enslaved person could work from sun up to sundown, their fingers raw and bleeding, and produce just 1 single pound of clean cotton. It was a bottleneck that choked the entire industry. The economics simply didn't work. For a moment, it seemed like the institution of slavery itself might slowly fade, dying under the weight of its own inefficiency. Eli Whitney watched this slow, painful work, and in a matter of days he saw the answer. He sketched out a simple, elegant machine, a box, a crank, and that hook-covered drum. The concept was genius. The drum would pull the raw cotton through a fine mesh screen. The fibers would slip through. The seeds, too large to pass, would be scraped away. He built a small prototype. He fed a handful of raw cotton into its wooden teeth. He turned the handle. The machine hummed to life, and in minutes it produced a pile of clean, fluffy cotton fiber bigger than a man could clean in an entire day. It was a miracle. This single, simple machine could do the work of 50 people. Whitney, a man of New England practicality and optimism, saw his invention as a great liberator. He believed his engine, or gin for short, would reduce the need for the grueling labor of cleaning cotton. He thought it might even lessen the need for slaves. He believed his machine would lessen the burden of labor, but he had no idea what he was about to unleash. Word of the cotton gin spread like wildfire through the Georgia backcountry. Planters came to see the device. They stood in silence, watching the crank turn, watching the seeds fall away. But they did not see a path to using less human labor. They saw the opposite. They saw a key that could unlock the vast fertile lands of the interior South. A key that could turn their fields into fountains of white gold. The gin solved the cleaning problem, but in doing so, it created a new, far more desperate demand. Now, the only limit to a planter's wealth was the number of hands he could put in the fields to plant and pick the crop. Planters saw the gin not as a way to use fewer slaves, but as a way to make each slave infinitely more profitable. Whitney and his business partner quickly secured a patent. They planned to build the gins themselves and then charge planters a hefty fee for their use, but the design was too simple, too effective, it was too easy to copy. Soon, blacksmiths on plantations and in small towns across the South were building their own versions. Knockoffs were everywhere. Whitney's dream of getting rich from his world-changing idea dissolved into a nightmare of endless, expensive lawsuits. He fought for years to protect his patent, but it was hopeless. The machine was out of his control. He had given the world an engine of immense power, and now he could only watch as others used it to build an empire he never intended. Whitney's invention was a work of genius, but it would not make him rich. Instead, it would create an economic monster with an insatiable, terrifying appetite. The sound is a sharp, sudden pop. It echoes off the high ceilings of a Charleston dining room, followed by the soft fizz of champagne pouring into a crystal glass. Laughter rises, light and unburdened. Men in fine wool coats raise their glasses. A planter, his face flushed with wine and success, stands to make a toast. His land, once barely profitable with tobacco, now yields a fortune he could only have dreamed of. The air is thick with the scent of cigar smoke and roasted meat. This is the sound of an explosion, an economic big bang triggered by a simple machine. The South was no longer a struggling agricultural region. It was becoming an empire built on a foundation of fluffy white fiber. And this planter, like thousands of others, was its new king. While champagne flowed in Charleston, Eli Whitney sat hundreds of miles away, surrounded by stacks of paper. The sound in his world was the dry rustle of legal briefs and the steady scratch of a lawyer's pen. He was drowning in debt. His patent was a worthless piece of parchment. His genius invention was being built in every backcountry forge and blacksmith shop from Georgia to the Mississippi. He had handed the South a key to unimaginable wealth, and they had locked him out of the treasury. The machine was too simple, too profitable to be contained by lawsuits. He had created the engine of a new economy, but he would not share in its spoils. He could only watch as his creation began to warp the soul of a nation. The change was brutally fast. The promise of cotton wealth triggered a human flood westward. The sound of the Old South, the slow creak of a porch swing, was drowned out by the thud of axes. Forests that had stood for 1,000 years fell in a matter of months. Land speculators swarmed into the territories that would become Alabama and Mississippi, buying up vast tracts of virgin soil. They cleared the trees. They burned the brush. They laid out the endless geometric rows. They were preparing the ground for the new god, King Cotton, and the new god demanded sacrifice. Every new cotton field cleared in Mississippi or Alabama required a new infusion of bodies to work it. The demand became a fever. Planters once content with their holdings now gambled everything on expansion. They took on massive debt to buy more land, and then even more debt to acquire the enslaved people needed to make that land productive. The entire Southern economy was reconfiguring itself around this single crop. Banks, merchants, shipping companies, all of them hitched their fortunes to the cotton boom. The machine had created an economic addiction. The first taste was intoxicating, but soon the addiction required a larger and larger dose to feel the same effect. More land, more cotton, and always more labor. The source for that labor had for over 200 years been the ships arriving from Africa. A constant horrific pipeline of human beings that fed the agricultural machine. But the political winds were shifting. A new federal law was coming. A hard deadline was set. The international slave trade was to be abolished. The Southern economy was now addicted to cotton, and cotton was addicted to enslaved labor. But in 188, the federal government was about to cut off the primary supply chain, creating a crisis that would be solved in the most inhuman way imaginable. A heavy wooden gavel strikes a block of oak. The sound is final, a sharp, definitive crack that echoes through the chamber of the United States Congress. A clerk's voice, clear and steady, cuts through the resulting silence. The act prohibiting importation of slaves is passed. The date is March 2nd, 187. The law is set to take effect on the first day of 188. On the floor, men stand and shake hands. A politician from Vermont, a fierce abolitionist, feels a swell of righteous triumph. He has fought for this for years. He has given speeches detailing the unspeakable horrors of the Middle Passage, the chains, the filth, the disease, the millions of lives lost in the dark holds of ships. In his mind, this law is a moral cleansing, a stake through the heart of the international slave trade. He believes America has finally taken a stand, that it has chosen a better path. He hears the sound of history turning a page. He is deaf to the sound of a different mechanism just beginning to grind its gears. Hundreds of miles to the south, a Virginia tobacco planter hears the news. He doesn't hear a moral victory. He hears the ticking of a clock and the frantic scratching of a pen on an account book. The cotton boom is roaring. The demand for bodies from the new territories in the West is a ceaseless scream, and the federal government has just announced its intention to turn off the spigot. He looks out at his own enslaved population, and the math he does is cold, simple, and terrifying. Demand is about to explode. Supply is about to be severed. For the politicians in Washington, the law was an ending. For this planter and for thousands like him, it was a business opportunity. The slave ships from Africa would stop, but the trade in human lives was about to move inland. The law created an immediate seismic shock in the marketplace of human beings. Before the ban, an enslaved field hand might cost $300. Within a few years, that price would triple. A skilled blacksmith or carpenter could fetch nearly $200. The human beings already trapped within America's borders were now a finite resource, and their value skyrocketed overnight. Every man, woman, and child held in bondage became a more precious asset. Enslavers who had always been cruel now became meticulous investors guarding their capital. The value of an enslaved person already in America instantly doubled. This new math changed everything. It transformed the very purpose of slavery in the older states like Virginia and Maryland. Their soil was wearing out from tobacco farming. They couldn't compete with the vast fertile cotton fields of the Deep South, but they had something the new Cotton Kingdom desperately needed. They had a surplus of enslaved people. Before, a planter's wealth was measured by the crops his slaves could produce. Now, a new commodity became just as valuable as cotton or tobacco. That commodity was the next generation of enslaved children, and the womb of every enslaved woman became a potential source of immense profit. The focus shifted from importation to propagation. The language of the farm ledger began to mirror the language of the livestock auction. Enslavers started tracking fertility cycles. They recorded the birth dates of children with the same care they use for prize-winning horses. They offered rewards, extra food, a new dress to women who bore many children. They punished women who did not. They systematically broke apart families, selling husbands away from wives, but keeping the breeding women who were most fertile. An enslaved woman was no longer just a worker. She was a capital asset capable of producing more assets. Her body was a factory. Her children were the product. The politicians who voted for the 188 ban thought they were containing a moral poison. Instead, they had created the perfect conditions for it to mutate into something new, something homegrown. The law had closed the front door, but it had just unlocked a back door to a new kind of hell. A new industry was born, one that didn't import commodities but bred them. The voice is flat, devoid of emotion, like a man reading a list of inventory. The dry scratch of a pen follows each observation. Girl, 16 years, good hips, strong teeth, should be a good breeder. The words hang in the dusty air of a Virginia manor house, a place where generations of planters had worried over the price of tobacco. But the man making these notes is not a farmer. He is a new kind of merchant, and his ledger isn't for crops. It's for people. The owner of the house, a man whose land is exhausted, listens to the assessment. The wind outside rattles a loose window pane, a constant reminder of the thin, tired soil that can no longer support him. He once measured his year by the rhythm of planting and harvest. Now he measures it by a different calendar. He listens for the cries of newborn infants in the slave quarters. He watches the young girls in his possession, not for their skill in the house or the fields, but for the moment they become women. He has learned a new and terrible arithmetic. The exhausted earth beneath his feet can no longer produce wealth, but the bodies of the people he owns can. This was the brutal new reality of the Upper South. States like Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina became the engine of a new domestic trade. The language used on these plantations began to change. It became cold, detached, agricultural. Enslavers spoke of their human property as stock. They calculated the increase of their holdings through forced births. They prized a woman's fertility above all else. In their journals and account books, they tracked lineages and bloodlines with the same dispassionate precision a rancher would use for his cattle. Human beings were no longer just laborers. They were now a cash crop. This system twisted the very idea of family into a grotesque parody. A strong family unit, a husband and wife with children, was a complication. It was an emotional bond that made a sale more difficult, more fraught with resistance. From a purely financial perspective, it was an inefficient package. A young woman's value was calculated by her individual reproductive potential, not by her role as a wife or mother. Enslavers quickly learned the cold logic of the market. Families were a liability. A fertile young woman sold alone was a far better investment. So, they engineered the destruction of families with chilling efficiency. Husbands were sold south while their wives were kept in Virginia. Toddlers were allowed to stay with their mothers only until they were old enough to be sold for a small, quick profit. But the real money was in the teenage girls. They were inspected, appraised, and sold at the peak of their childbearing years, destined for the massive new plantations in Mississippi and Louisiana. A Virginia planter's primary export was no longer the leaf he cured in his barn. It was the children born in his slave cabins. The sound of his wealth was no longer the rustle of tobacco leaves. It was the jingle of a trader's coin purse and the weeping of a mother whose child had just been sold away forever. The entire economy of the old slave states reoriented itself around this production line. But to turn people into products, you first had to break them. And in cities like Richmond, a special kind of factory was built for exactly that purpose. The sound of that door was the sound of a world ending. It echoed across a swampy, foul-smelling plot of land in Richmond, Virginia, a place the people trapped there called the Devil's Half-Acre. This was the headquarters of a man named Robert Lumpkin, and his business was the disassembly of human beings. Lumpkin's jail was not just a holding cell. It was the central factory in the new domestic slave trade, a place where men, women, and children arrived as people and were processed into commodities. They would be marched through the gates in small, terrified groups, often straight from the Virginia estates where they were born. The first thing that happened was the stripping away of identity. A clerk with ink-stained fingers would take down a name only to replace it with a tag on their wrist or a number in a ledger. A father became inventory number 74, a daughter number 75. The cold finality of it was absolute. Here, names were replaced with numbers and families were shattered for profit. The jail itself was a compound of horror. There were the holding pens called slave jails or pens where dozens of people were crammed into small windowless brick buildings, sleeping on bare floors. The air was thick with fear and sickness. There was the auction house with its raised platform where a man's worth was debated and a woman's body was inspected by callous hands. And then there were the other rooms, the ones people whispered about, the breaking rooms. In a small shed, Lumpkin had a whipping post. He had irons. He had a screw torture device for crushing thumbs. Any sign of defiance, any hint of rebellion was met with systematic, calculated violence designed to crush the will to resist. Robert Lumpkin was a master of this cruel industry. He was not a raging sadist in the typical sense. He was a businessman. He advertised his services in Richmond newspapers, promising secure accommodations for traders passing through. He charged a fee for holding people, a commission on sales, and an extra rate for disciplining those deemed unruly. He built a comfortable brick house for his own family right there on the property, so close he could hear the screams from the whipping post over his dinner. The cries of separated families were simply the sound of his business operating smoothly. Lumpkin treated human suffering as a simple matter of logistics and accounting. Consider a husband and wife holding their small child standing in the muddy yard. They have been together their whole lives. The trader who bought them from their old master now negotiates their fate with Lumpkin's agents. The husband is strong, a good field hand. He will fetch a high price in the cotton belt. The wife is young and has already borne one healthy child. She is a valuable breeder for a Louisiana sugar plantation. The child is too young to work, a drain on resources for the long journey south. The cold economic logic is undeniable. The family unit must be broken up to maximize the profit. The moment comes with no warning. Two guards step forward, one grabs the husband's arm, another takes the wife. The child is pulled from her mother's grasp. The screaming starts. It is a raw animal sound of pure agony, but it is a sound the guards and traders have heard 1,000 times before. It does not slow them down. The man is dragged toward a pen with other men destined for a coffle heading to Tennessee. The woman is shoved toward a different building filled with other women who will be sold individually. Her child is taken to a separate quarter to be sold locally for a pittance or held until old enough to be more valuable. They might get one last look at each other across the muddy yard. A final desperate connection before the iron doors slam shut between them forever. This scene was Lumpin's business model repeated day after day. It was the engine of the domestic slave trade. For those who were sold and broken at Lumpkins, the terror was far from over. Next came the long, brutal journey south. The first sound was a low metallic clinking. It started with one man, then another, a discordant rhythm that grew into a steady percussive beat. The rhythmic clank of iron on iron. This was the sound of the coffle being assembled. Dozens of men chained together by their necks and wrists were herded into a long single file line. Women and older children walked alongside, tied together with coarse rope. Traders on horseback moved along the line, their voices sharp and guttural, counting heads like livestock. A man in the line turns for one last look at the smoke-stained brick of the jail. He searches the faces of the crowd that has gathered to watch, a silent, grim audience to the morning's routine. He is looking for a wife, a child, a brother, anyone familiar in this sea of strangers. But he sees no one he knows. The life he had, the family he loved, had been erased inside those walls. Now there was only the road ahead. The crack of a whip splits the morning air, not hitting flesh, but serving as a starting gun. The long line lurches forward. Feet shuffle on the dusty road. The clinking of chains becomes a constant grinding soundtrack. This human chain would walk for hundreds of miles from Virginia to Tennessee. From Maryland to Mississippi, they were walking from a place they knew to a fate they could only imagine. Each step was a step further away from home. Each sunrise revealed a landscape that was more alien than the last. The journey became a blur of exhaustion and pain. The sun beat down. The dust kicked up by 50 pairs of feet filled their lungs, caking their faces. Water was scarce. Food was a meager portion of cornmeal and pork. People stumbled, they fell. Those who could not keep the pace were met with brutal efficiency. The whip would fall, this time with a wet, sickening thud. Cries would erupt, but they were quickly stifled. The line could not stop. The traders had a schedule to keep. Their profits depended on delivering their goods to market on time. Any delay, any weakness was a threat to the bottom line. The sick were sometimes left on the side of the road to die. Their chains were simply unlocked, and the line moved on without them, the gap quickly closing. There was no room for grief. There was only the next step and the one after that. This journey was designed to strip away every last ounce of hope and identity. It was a mobile factory of despair, finishing the work that began in the breaking pens. Night offered little relief. They slept on the hard ground, still chained under the watchful eyes of armed guards. The sounds were different then. The clinking of chains was replaced by quiet sobs, by whispered prayers, by the low moans of the injured. These were the sounds of humanity, refusing to be completely extinguished. But with the dawn, the metallic rhythm would begin again. The march, the Sunday, the dust. This was the second Middle Passage. It was not a journey across an ocean in the hull of a ship, but an overland trek across the heart of a nation. Historians estimate that nearly 1 million enslaved people were moved from the Upper South to the Deep South in this way. It was one of the largest forced migrations in human history. They were the fuel for the Cotton Kingdom, and this was the pipeline that delivered them. After weeks on the road, the landscape began to change. The red clay of Virginia gave way to the black, swampy soil of the Delta. The air grew thick and heavy with humidity. Strange birds called from unfamiliar trees. The men and women in the coffle knew they were getting close. They could feel it. The dread was a physical weight as heavy as the iron around their necks. They were walking into the furnace. The end of the road was a cotton plantation in the Deep South, a place where the demand for labor was so total it consumed life itself. The first sound of the day is not the Sunday. It is a low, sorrowful hum, a single voice cutting through the predawn blackness of the cabin. It is a spiritual, a thread of melody woven into the suffocating humidity. This is the only moment of peace, a moment stolen before the day steals everything else. Then a different sound rips through the air. A harsh blast from a conch shell or the brutal clang of an iron bell. It is an order, not a greeting. The day has begun. They move in the darkness. shadows slipping from cabins towards the endless rows of green plants dotted with white. They work from can't see to can't see. The day begins before the sun rises and ends long after it has set. In the faint gray light, the work starts. The cotton bolls, while soft, are protected by a husk of sharp woody points. To pick the fiber is to tear your flesh. Fingers are a constant landscape of small cuts, old scars, and fresh blood. The pain becomes a dull, steady ache, a part of the rhythm of the work. Each person drags a long canvas sack that grows heavier with every step, the strap digging a raw groove into their shoulder. The sun was their clock, and the overseer was their god. He circles on horseback, a silent, menacing presence. His silence is worse than his shouting. It means he is watching, calculating, looking for any sign of slowing down. The only sound from the fields is the soft rustle of leaves and the thud of cotton being stuffed into sacks. No one speaks. To talk is to waste energy, to risk a lashing for idleness. The sun climbs, a merciless white disk in the sky. Sweat streams down, stinging the cuts on their hands, blurring their vision. Backs scream in protest from the constant stooping position. There is no break for lunch. They eat on their feet. A piece of cornbread clutched in a dirty hand, swallowed down with a swig of warm water from a gourd. The work never stops. As dust begins to bleed purple into the sky, the bell rings again. But the day is not over. This is the moment of judgment. They drag their heavy sacks, some weighing over 100 lb, to a central scale. They line up, silent and trembling with exhaustion. Each person's fear a palpable thing in the cooling air. The overseer or the master himself stands at the weigh-in, a ledger in his hand. One by one they heave their sacks onto the hook. The needle on the scale decides their fate. If they have met their quota, they might be granted a few hours of exhausted peace. If they are short, even by a single pound, the punishment is swift and public. The sound of a whip striking flesh is the final lesson of the day. Even for those who meet their quota, the night offers little comfort. A meager meal of salted pork and more cornmeal is eaten in near darkness. There is just enough time to tend to the cuts, to wash the dust away before collapsing onto a thin pallet. Sleep is not her release. It is a shallow, dreamless state of pure physical depletion. The body aches, the mind is numb. This crushing exhaustion is a tool as powerful as any chain or whip. It is a cage built of fatigue designed to leave a person too broken to fight, too weary to run. Rest was not a right, it was a luxury they could never afford. This was the engine of the cotton kingdom, fueled by human stamina, lubricated with fear. Every boll of cotton that filled the northern mills and the ships bound for England was picked by a hand that was bleeding, attached to a back that was breaking. This cycle of labor was absolute, a total theft of a person's life day after grueling day. But the physical exhaustion of the fields was only one dimension of the horror. For enslaved women, an entirely different and more intimate terror awaited them inside the master's own house. The sound is muffled, indistinct. The laughter of children playing in a yard, filtered through layers of wood and plaster. The angry stomp of a man's boots on the floorboards below. Then closer, a different sound. The dry, frantic scratching of a rat scurrying in the darkness just inches away. This was the world of Harriet Jacobs, a world just 9 ft long, 7 ft wide, and at its highest point only 3 ft tall. This tiny, suffocating crawl space was not her prison. It was her sanctuary. For 7 years, this was her universe. Harriet Jacobs was not a field, and she was enslaved in the household of a doctor, a man who did not want her labor, but her body. He pursued her with a relentless, suffocating obsession. He whispered threats. He made promises. He waged a campaign of psychological terror designed to break her spirit and force her into his bed. She refused. Her defiance was quiet, but absolute. When she realized she could not physically escape him, she devised a plan of breathtaking audacity. She would not run away. She would vanish. She coordinated with her grandmother, a free black woman, who hid her in the tiny, unventilated space above a storeroom in her own home. The heat in the summer was an oven, baking the very air out of her lungs. The winter cold was a penetrating ache that settled deep in her bones. She could not stand. She could barely sit upright. She spent her days lying on her side, peering through a small hole she had bored in a wooden plank. Through that tiny aperture, she watched the world go on without her. It was a torture unlike any other. She could hear her own children playing outside, their voices so clear, so painfully close. She could see them grow, hear them learn to speak, but she could not call out to them. Every day was a tightrope walk of terror. The smallest cough, the slightest movement could betray her presence. Every creak of the floorboards below sent a jolt of pure panic through her. When her former master would visit the house, his voice would travel up through the floor, a sound that made the blood freeze in her veins. He would sit just feet below her hiding place, speaking of his search for her, vowing what he would do when he found her. She would lie there, motionless, barely breathing, a ghost in her own home. This agonizing self-imprisonment was her only weapon. In that cramped, dark space, she achieved what he could never allow. She reclaimed control over her own body. She chose this physical torment over the spiritual death of submission. Her master owned the deed to her body, but in that attic she owned her soul. She was fighting a silent, desperate war of attrition. One woman against an entire system, surviving on scraps of food and immense reserves of will. But across the South, other forms of resistance, far from silent, were about to explode into open, bloody warfare. The sound carries for miles on a still night, the frantic baying howls of dogs on a scent. It is followed by a deeper sound, a rhythmic thundering that shakes the ground, galloping hooves. This is the sound of the slave patrol. They were the enforcers of the open-air prison that was the American South. They were farmers and overseers by day, but at night they became hunters. Armed with guns and whips, they patrolled the roads, the swamps, the forests, searching for anyone moving without a pass. Their authority was absolute. They could stop, question, and punish any black person they found, free or enslaved. They were the first line of defense for the entire system, a constant, menacing reminder that there was no real escape. The landscape itself was weaponized against the enslaved. Wanted posters for runaways were nailed to trees and tavern doors, their crude drawings turning a human face into a public target. Some who were caught were forced to wear iron collars, heavy and cruel, often fitted with bells that announced their every move. The constant soft jingle was a public declaration of defiance and punishment. The system was designed to create a constant state of fear. This ever-present terror was meant to crush the soul, to make resistance seem impossible. It turned every shadow into a threat, and every neighbor into a potential informant. It was a suffocating blanket of psychological warfare. But for one man, fear was about to be replaced by a divine and righteous fury. His name was Nat Turner. He was not a field hand broken by labor, but a skilled carpenter and a preacher. He could read and write, a rare and dangerous ability. He studied the Bible not as a tool of submission, but as a book of prophecy, of justice, of divine retribution. He saw the world differently than other people. He saw signs where others saw nature. He saw droplets of blood on the stalks of corn in the field. He saw hieroglyphic figures in the leaves of the forest. These were not random occurrences to him. They were messages. They were whispers from God. He prayed and he fasted, seeking a clearer sign, a direct command. In February of 1831, he got one. The sun itself was blotted from the sky in a solar eclipse. To his master, it was a curiosity. To Nat Turner, it was the final signal. He gathered a small group of trusted followers in the woods. He opened the Bible. He told them that the time of judgment was at hand. He was not just planning an escape. He was planning a war. He would use the slaveholders' own religion as his justification, turning their scripture into a sword. His faith, which was meant to make him Doyle, had instead become a catalyst for one of the most violent slave rebellions in American history. The terror that had been used to control him for so long was about to be turned back on his oppressors with apocalyptic force. Turner's rebellion was a brutal, violent eruption that was just as brutally crushed. Yet a more subtle, widespread, and ingenious form of resistance was being sung softly in the fields every single day. The sound begins as a low whisper in the cypress swamp, almost lost in the chirp of crickets. A single human voice, then two, then a small chorus singing softly into the thick, dark air. The melody is weighed in the water to a distant overseer making his rounds. It might sound like a simple hymn, a prayer offered up to the night sky. He might even find it peaceful, proof of the simple faith he encourages. But he is not the intended audience. The song is not a prayer, it is an order, for a small group of people hiding in the reeds, their hearts pounding against their ribs. Those words are a set of life-saving instructions. The baying of dogs grows closer. The song tells them exactly what to do next. Get into the stream, hide their scent and erase their trail. To the overseer, it was just a song. To an escapee, it was a lifeline. This was the genius of the spirituals, a secret language hidden in plain sight. It was a parallel communication system broadcasted openly across the fields and through the woods. The songs spoke of biblical freedom of Moses leading his people from bondage, a narrative the masters tolerated. But woven into the verses were practical coded messages. The song "Steal Away" was a quiet call to a secret meeting that night to plan a run. The lyrics seemed to describe a religious rapture, but they were really a summons. The masters heard religious devotion. The enslaved heard the time and place for a conspiracy. This was a war fought with melody, a rebellion carried on the air itself. The greatest weapon in this arsenal was a song called "Follow the Drinking Gourd." It was not just a tune for a long day's work, it was a map. The drinking gourd was the Big Dipper constellation. The song instructed the listener to follow it north, keeping the North Star in sight. Each verse was a landmark, a guidepost on an invisible railroad describing dead trees, riverbends, and safe houses disguised as quail calls. It was a secret knowledge, a folkstronomy of liberation passed down from one person to another. A map that could never be confiscated or destroyed because it existed only in memory and song. This secret war of song and starlight had a general, a commander who moved through the darkness with absolute certainty, and a faith she believed was guided by God. They called her Moses. Her real name was Harriet Tubman. As a child, a brutal overseer had thrown a heavy iron weight that struck her in the head. The injury left her with sleeping spells and vivid prophetic visions for the rest of her life. She believed these were messages from the divine, a calling. She had escaped slavery herself, but freedom was not enough if her family and her people remained in chains, so she went back again and again. Harriet Tubman did not just lead people, she engineered their freedom. She made 19 separate trips into the heart of the slave states. She guided more than 300 people to the north. Her missions were masterpieces of planning, discipline, and sheer nerve. She moved only at night, using the stars and her deep, intuitive knowledge of the terrain to navigate the treacherous landscape of forests and swamps. She communicated with her passengers using coded bird calls or whispered phrases from spirituals. A particular note sung into the darkness could mean all clear or lie down, danger ahead. Her authority was absolute. She carried a small pistol, and she made it clear it was for two kinds of enemies: the slave catchers who hunted them, and any person in her group who lost their nerve and threatened to turn back. There was no turning back. Surrender or capture would compromise the entire network, exposing the secret routes and the brave people who operated the safe houses. Her courage was legendary. Bounty posters went up across the South, offering a massive reward for her capture, but no one knew what she looked like. She was a ghost, a rumor, a prayer on the lips of the enslaved. And she was perfect. In 19 missions through 1,000 miles of hostile territory, Harriet Tubman never lost a single passenger. She outsmarted every slave patrol, every bounty hunter, every bloodhound sent after her. She was a living embodiment of defiance, a walking testament to the fact that the human spirit could not be cataloged in a ledger or broken in a jail. She proved that the will to be free was a force of nature, more powerful than any chain. This spirit of unbreakable resistance, this brilliant fight for freedom, existed in the very same world as the cold, a calculating system of the breeding farms, a system whose human cost we are now ready to fully comprehend.